Ladies and gentlemen, it is time. Time to discuss what I feel is the most universally agreed upon as to being the absolute worst game in the Resident Evil series, that being Resident Evil 6. This is in spite of this game being one of the highest selling Resident Evil games in the franchise, even more so than the acclaimed Resident Evil 4, up until the remake obviously. While this should never be a benchmark for if a game is actually good or not, this does go to show the amount of interest and expectations this game had going into it. Instead, what we got was a kind of narrative mess, an insane UI, in a game whose gameplay consisted more of QuickTime events than actual gameplay. But rather than dwell here into the intro, let's dive into what makes this game so reviled by fans of the series, while highlighting some of the positive points. Yes, there are a few along the way. Now, I'll be honest, if this game didn't have a Resident Evil name in the title, this would probably be an entirely different video, but more on that soon. I never actually played this until making this video, and I don't think that I ever played a more conflicting game thus far in my life, but let's continue. If you enjoy this type of content, consider subscribing to the channel. We've done series from like Dead Rising, Wolfenstein, some one-offs, and after all, and what you're here for, Resident Evil. I have a lot more planned for the rest of 2023, so you don't want to miss out. With all that out of the way, let's delve into why Resident Evil 6 is such a strange, jumbled bag of mess for me.
Back for more.
Resident Evil 6.
I'll be honest, while writing the script, it was kind of hard to know where to begin with this cavalcade of a game. So let's do what we always do and start at the core of what any video game entails, that being the actual gameplay of Resident Evil 6. Continuing with what came before in the last two entries in the franchise, we do have a more action-focused title of Resident Evil here, but this is taken up to over 9,000. Now, in the last two videos, I did really kind of buck against the action trend that was happening in survival horror at the time, and I think those feelings were justified to agree to get them off of my chest. However, I do understand that the franchise needed to grow, and with that, change with the times, that being becoming a more action-focused style of gameplay rather than the slow plotting of the originals. Yes, one can learn from the comments, imagine that. And with rolling with 4 separate campaigns in Resident Evil 6, that's right, 4, with 4 separate groups of protagonists, each of these campaigns sets out to have a slightly different feel than the last. Each campaign is split into 4 separate pairs: Leon and Helena, Chris and Piers, Jake and Shelley Birkin from Resident Evil 2, and Ada Wong and Mysterious Agent Number 1, if you have a co-op partner. And while it seems that the intended goal is to make each campaign different, they all kind of end up feeling like a run and gun shoot fest filled with their own bombastic set pieces. I mentioned in the last two videos, but starting with Resident Evil 4, you can feel the shift in the style of the series, turning into more action focused rather than survival horror. Looking back at the first 3 games, however, in the series, there were 3 tenets that were the through line, even up until 4, and I would even say to a degree 5, that being tension building, resource management, and then honing the two to build on each other. Resident Evil 4 was the turning point of this series, and while still regarded as the best, it was so by still threading the needle that the core game set out to do originally, that being tension and resource management. Resident Evil 5 began to lean way more into the action side, and Resident Evil 6 takes it all to its natural conclusion. Long gone are the long hallways, tight quarters, and debating on using your shotgun because you only have 3 shells left with none in sight, or using your pistol where you only have 5 rounds left. Now we're just lobbing grenades out of a grenade launcher attachment from our fully automatic rifle, then swapping to our automatic shotgun to blast our way out of a corner, followed by the 1-2 kick to explode the head of a separatist terrorist combatant, and then using a rocket launcher to take down a helicopter. And while subjectively this action actually doesn't feel all that bad to me when playing, the entire spirit of what made Resident Evil so popular is just absolutely gone. What we have now is a giant action cinematic QuickTime event that features mutated humans. Keep in mind too that this was a franchise that spawned the entire conception of survival horror. Without Resident Evil, it's hard to believe we would even have games like Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, The Evil Within, Amnesia, or even Dead Space, which just had an awesome remake. As mentioned before, this game sports 4 separate campaigns, all of which center around different themes and playstyles. Leon's, which attempts to create the same feel as Resident Evil 4, albeit a little bit faster. Chris, whose campaign plays a lot more like a third-person shooter like Gears of War or Spec Ops: The Line. Jake, which has a slight focus into hand-to-hand combat, and Ada, who's the only solo campaign in the game, focuses more on the puzzle aspect of what we've known from the Resident Evil games in the past. And while I like this idea in theory, where Resident Evil 6 fails is making any of these feel truly distinct and leaving most of them feeling pretty half-baked. With Jake, for example, you're not using your hand-to-hand combat more than 3 separate times in the campaign, and all of them distill down to 2 separate movesets, the 3-hit combo we see with everybody, and a charge attack. And while powerful for sure, given the amount of enemies that you're going to be running into who are shooting you from far and running up to you close, this option feels only truly viable at the times where your guns are basically taken away. The rest of the time feels like a gun-filled, action-packed romp, leaving the differentiating mechanics to the side. Ada's campaign feels different due to the puzzle aspect, but given the fact that she's solo in her adventure, combat feels a lot more punishing to go through as well. This is by far the hardest campaign to me personally, given the amount of cramped quarters and vast amounts of masked mutants you're running into. My main issue with this game feels, though, is the sheer amount of set pieces that occur throughout. There's a saturation point in every piece of media when it comes to the amount of massive events that can occur before it just becomes another thing in the timeline, losing its appeal. Transformers is a solid example of this, which by the second movie of giant robots beating the piss out of each other and their transformations looking like just a pile of metal swirling and twirling around like a stupid ooey gooey gumdrop, it all begins to lose its luster as just being another thing that happens. Resident Evil 6 has this feeling, and by the time Chris has to blow up a tank on the bridge, then fight a tank on train tracks, then 2 massive biomutants right after that, everything that follows just kind of feels like another thing happening, rather than being this massive set piece it would have been on its own, or not sandwiched between the president being murdered and having the third fight with a giant unkillable biomutant with a chainsaw strapped to his arm. This all comes down to pacing once again, something that we touched on in the Resident Evil 5 video, but after the high octane fuel that is this game, it drowns every event subsequent to it in the rest of the game, especially the narrative, which is paper thin in its own right, with some nuggets of gold in there, which we're going to get to shortly. Inventory has also been dumbed down even further than games prior, being basically mitigated to a single bar of hot swap weapons and healing. You can still find red and green herbs that combine to make better healing items, but all this does is distill them to essentially making herb pills, which all end up being the same healing value, no matter how many you combine. As green and red, which used to just be a 1 full heal, is now 6 heals of the same amount, whereas combining 2 greens gives 3 pills and combining 3 greens gives 6. I personally miss how important herbs were as a resource in the prior games, and seeing their uses distilled down to just a number of times I can click a button just doesn't work for me anymore. There are also upgrades that you can buy at the end of each level with points you earn with the results at the end of each subchapter. And while some seem kind of cool and mildly game changing, I personally ran into paralysis of choice, having me only stick with just putting in the more damage, more defense, and finding more machine gun ammo for a bulk of this game. This goes for every campaign, but if you're gonna give me perks to slot in to make my character feel better, I feel like that there should definitely be less of them and make them all way more impactful. To feel like my character is getting better in some way rather than arbitrary stat boost or take away my reticle for double damage. This whole system just feels tacked on, and I don't know if it's a bug, but half the time, despite me hitting equip on the loadout, it wouldn't even be equipped at all by the end of the next chapter, which was absolutely confounding to me. I know I mildly complained about weapon upgrading in Resident Evil 4, but I would take that power creep any day over this useless system as a whole. I'd be remiss if we didn't take the time to discuss the co-op in Resident Evil 6 as well. Now, in the last video on Resident Evil 5, I must admit that I did not take into consideration how important the co-op feature was to the enjoyment of many people in this game. My perspective came from a person who had no one to co-op with and thus was resignated to using the AIs as my companions. My experience with this game is pretty much the same. However, I must admit that I did enjoy the AI companions much better here in Resident Evil 6 than I did in 5. I did notice my compadres actually killing things and picking me up in a timely manner, while minimally getting stuck on walls and corners as was the case in the 5th entry. Another aspect of Resident Evil 6, which was a nice addition, was the SelfRes mechanic, where if you just stayed out of harm's way after going down for a period of time, you would just kind of pick yourself back up, not relying solely on your AI companion or a teammate to do so. And while being in this down but not out state, you also have access to the weapon that you were holding at the time, making you not a complete sitting duck, able to at least ride the timer out to get up rather than just having to lay there and finally take the hit, giving more power to the solo player in this regard. However, this game defaults to creating an open lobby for anybody to join you mid-game, which was really confusing at first to me. And for somebody who hates relying on random scrubs to get further in a story-based game that he's trying to get footage of, this was not the way. I don't know how many times I started playing and there were still people hopping into my games, only for me to give them the boot pretty much instantaneously. I honestly couldn't believe that there's still people joining amazing co-op games in Resident Evil 6 11 years after release, but I guess there is a community for everything these days. So good on you guys. Keep playing what you want to play. That's pretty fucking cool in my book. Unlike Resident Evil 5, I do have to actually praise 6 on its movement. Coming off the stiffness that was 4 and 5, the moment-to-moment movement in 6 honestly feels pretty dang good. Whereas the other two games in the series felt slow and unresponsive at times, 6 not only felt snappy and quick, but gives the player a lot of options for dodging, evading, the infected roaming the area. From dodges to rolling on the ground, the snappiness of your guns and the melee combos you can perform, the player has a ton of options in dealing with the bad guys that are thrown at you. I specifically love rolling around on the ground, as not only is it just kind of fun to watch, but it can be used for a quick getaway and looks pretty cool while doing it. When everything clicks, there's a flow state in Resident Evil 6 that's actually a pretty damn good experience to play, despite me also feeling that this amount of movement is antithetical to the series as a whole. It's hard to argue, however, that movement shouldn't get better as technology and the game feel improves inherently with time, and the power given when creating games on newer platforms just makes this a natural. While the stilted movements in the prior games felt intentional, they were also done due to the limitations of the hardware at the time, thinking of tank controls here. I do think Capcom went overboard with the amount of power given to the player, and as this is what we got, I have to say that if this game was not a game continuing the Resident Evil series, it probably would have been pretty fucking awesome, much like Vanquish from Sega at the time. So it's hard to say that it wasn't fun to move around in this game. It's a hard feeling to have, and that's the joy of doing these things, to get the nuanced thoughts out there. I may be off base with this feeling, so let me know in the comments down below what you guys actually think of the moment-to-moment gameplay of Resident Evil 6. Am I off base, or am I kind of on point? Let me know in the comments below.
Because of Simmons. She's working for Neo Umbrella. You know what that means? Yeah, I do. And you're still going to protect this woman? I am.
Before hopping into the story, I would be remiss not to bring up the fact that even after 11 years after release, that this game still looks pretty fucking good overall in the graphical fidelity department, with one major caveat, that is that the setting has to be dark, which with this game is most of the time, minus a few scenes at the end or epilogues. The lighting on display here is actually awesome and unrivaled in many ways. The lighting occlusion is on point, the amount of colors that saturate the space while not being overbearing really make this game pop visually, and use the lighting to highlight important areas is done pretty well here. Just the neon signs saturating the downtown streets of China just absolutely left my jaw dropped for half of it when I first was playing through Leon's campaign. However, when the lights turn on and the daytime is in effect, this game shows its age pretty damn bad. I mean, compare these two scenes. Oof. These games have always been pushing the boundaries for graphical fidelity, even now with Resident Evil 4 Remake, but I was amazed at how well the game looked today, 11 years after release. While not important overall, I did feel it was something worth calling out. From here, I think we really need to start diving into the story of Resident Evil 6. With 4 separate campaigns, this is definitely going to be a long one, ladies and gentlemen, so don't be surprised that this video is going to go even longer. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
Questioning my desire to reveal the truth. I know where they're coming from. It might create more problems than it solves. A lesson I learned well in the military. Bioorganic weapons are a global threat, and we are partly to blame. We have to come clean and start working with the rest of the world if we want to have any chance of fighting this.
Whatever you decide, sir, I'm with you.
I've always valued your friendship, Leon. It's time we take responsibility and end this mess.
From the initial boot of Resident Evil 6, I had a feeling that something was going to be off with this game. Upon booting up the campaign, you see 4 names listed: Leon, Chris, Jake, and Ada. 4 campaigns, 1 game. The idea of having that Avenger Style moment in Resident Evil universe and bringing all the main protagonists, minus Jill and Claire, back for a big finale is a great idea on paper. However, I believe that this is the root cause of this game feeling disjointed and all over the place. Look at yourself in real life. If you have a singular focus that you put all of your time and attention attention into, generally speaking, your end product will come out stronger and more succinct. Whereas if you're splitting your focus and attention on getting multiple things done, there's less dedication to one project or item, leading to all just kind of feeling weaker and disjointed. The same can be said for games. I mean, really, how many games do we play that have 4 separate narratives and protagonists in one package? Not many. The last time I could think of was actually Grand Theft Auto 5, and narrowly this game did suffer a little bit as well, becoming more of the Michael and Trevor show by the latter half of the game, with Franklin kind of being off to the side. And that game had about 5 years to cook in the dev cycle, whereas Resident Evil 6 only took about 3. And while mentioned before, having this Avenger style moment with a ton of returning Resident Evil members is a great idea, it's just not executed on well here at all. Each group of players tend to cross paths for brief moments at a time, but never last for longer than 5 to 10 minutes, either just a cutscene or a boss fight. So let's delay no further and let's hop in with the fan favorite returning Leon S. Kennedy. We meet Leon in the city of Tall Oaks in a massive zombie attack, helping a defenseless Helena through the back alleys, only to jump into a street fighting hordes of zombies and running to a helicopter on tops of roof of cars, only then to be subsequently shot down and taken to the main menu. Instantly, just in this short prelude tutorial sequence, we can get the tone of what we're going to be getting in this cold open. These events actually take place in the middle of the campaign, giving an insight to the conflict at hand, while also tutorializing Resident Evil 6 as a whole. However, with little context, this set of action pieces serves really just to set the stage and teach the player basics of Resident Evil 6. However, we do get to see Hunnigan, your over-the-radio help in Resident Evil 4, is back, which is a touch I can actually appreciate, the two staying together long after the incidents of 4. We then go back to the very beginning, focusing on Leon aiming at a zombie, staying his hand until the zombie attacks Helena, his Secret Service bodyguard. We learn that this was actually the president he shot, as he was giving a lecture and planning to discuss on classified information regarding the Raccoon City incident, how it was actually a chemical attack perpetrated by the Umbrella Corporation, before being blown off the face of the map. Helena blames herself for the president's death, and upon briefing Hunnigan, claims that Leon may have a lead on who's responsible for the attack at the cathedral nearby. Leon, not knowing anything about this, plays along with the lie, and the two form a tenuous relationship. Leon obviously skeptical of Helena, there's for sure something she's not telling, given her reaction to the president's death and now leading him to a random cathedral in town.
God help us. Alright, I'll submit the report. You two just focus on getting the hell out of there. The virus has already spread 3 miles past the campus perimeter and it's not slowing down.
Upon murdering tons of zombies as the infection is spread throughout the town, the two reach a cathedral, and after some problem-solving Bell shooting and killing a giant infected, the two make their way into the catacombs to reach a strange lab located underneath the church. Hidden amongst the test tube is a video of Ada Wong, Leon's wannabe boo, bursting from a cocoon naked and sticky. Like, huh? We also find Helena's sister Deborah, which is obviously the reason we're here. But upon Helena grabbing her sister, she morphs into a chrysalis of sorts and then bursts out as another mutant. Ada then shows up, and after what feels like a 20-minute fight, we murder Deborah and learn from Helena that it was actually Simmons, aide to the president, who kidnapped Deborah and forced Helena to aid in the assassination of the president, hence her reaction earlier.
No more tears. Not until I avenge your death. Please. Forgive me.
Ada pieces out as she normally does, and out for revenge, the pair call Hunnigan to tell her what was actually going on, only to be answered by Simmons himself, who in turn threatens to frame the pair for the murder of the president unless they come and join him. The two make their way to the surface, only to see the entire city being attacked by missiles, the same way Raccoon City was. The pair escape, and learning that Simmons was heading to China, Leon and Helena enlist the help of their mutual friend Hunnigan and fake their deaths in the explosion to travel to China. While on the plane, Leon and Helena find a biomutant C-Vice carrier stashed on the plane, and after ejecting them out of the luggage department down below, go back to the main cabin to find all the passengers have turned as well, with the pilot now dead as also. The two must try to land the plane despite not knowing how to fly. I want to hold here for a second, as this section here may be one of the best scenes in the entire game. I have a fascination with airplanes and tragedies occurring upon them. I know that probably makes me sadistic and weird, but the cramped corridors contending with outside forces on the plane and the ability to take a space that takes just 2 minutes to walk from front to back and create a halfway decent level out of it is something I'm just an absolute sucker for. I love the plane epilogue and the end of Modern Warfare for the same reason, as well as the plane level in Rainbow Six Siege. I'm a sucker for planes, what can I say? Anyway, back to the story. We crash the plane in downtown China, which is now in the middle of its own biochemical terrorist attack, and run into Sherry Birkin, who you may remember being the small girl from Resident Evil 2, as well as being accompanied by Jake, a mercenary for hire. Why these two are together we will learn soon enough, and after finding out that they're going to report to Simmons, who's also in China if we remember, and are actually on the way to meet him, Leon attempts to tell the two what happened with the president and Simmons' true colors. The four are then attacked by a burly mutant with giant mechanical arms that Jake and Sherry are painfully knowledgeable of, and the four go to work on trying to defeat him. After the fight, the pairs end up separated. Sherry gives Leon the location of Simmons, and the four move separately to meet up and confront him on their own. Catching eyes on Ada, however, Leon and Helena give chase, and after running through a research facility, meet up with Chris Redfield and his partner Piers, who's in a fit of rage chasing Ada as well, blaming her for all the bio attacks that have happened recently, as well as murdering his squad as part of the group called Neo Umbrella. Leon insists that it was Simmons who perpetrated the attacks and asks Chris to trust him and to not murder Ada despite wanting to catch her. Chris agrees and the pair split again, and upon reaching Simmons, kill him on a train, and then after a quick dust off, get a call from Chris telling him that Ada is also dead and to evacuate the city, as a missile loaded with C-virus explodes in the middle of town, infecting the entire population. Determined to survive, Leon and Helena fight their way through the infected streets of China, only to find Simmons not actually dead. Surprise, surprise. After a string of fights with mounted machine guns, helicopters, him turning into a T-Rex, as well as a giant spider using lightning rods to knock him off a building, Leon and Helena work their way to the roofs, and upon seeing Ada and Simmons still duking it out in a glass hallway, Leon jumps down to assist his wannabe boo and end Simmons once and for all.
Helena, cover me! Ada, can you hear me? It could end like this.
I was just resting my eyes.
You shouldn't sleep on the job.
Leon and Helena make it to the helicopter, while Ada gives him a makeup kit and a flash drive and zips away and leave the tragedy behind. The information Ada gave them was all the incriminating evidence to clear their name and ensure that Simmons was blamed for all the attacks. We meet up with them after the fact, now seeing Leon and Helena truly becoming partners, their names cleared with the evidence Ada provided, and move on to the next mission. And going back, this is by far the best campaign in Resident Evil 6, with some decent plot twists, true stakes, and interesting set pieces like the plane scene in the fight on the elevator. Leon is real rough and tumble in this one, dropping the amount of pithy one-liners in his Rolodex since his last outing in Resident Evil 4, but seeing him suspect Helena from the very beginning, as well as his need, nay desire, to protect and save Ada is commendable, given how many times she's cucked him over and over again in every game she's been in. His interactions with Shelly and seeing the imprint he left on her after the events of Resident Evil 2 was nice and a good interaction and callback to the original outing. And even though we never see Chris and Leon actually fight together until this game, you can see the fellow camaraderie in the two when they meet in the factory. I mean, Leon did work with his sister in Resident Evil 2 in order to escape Raccoon City, so the two obviously know of each other, so this moment of seeing the two main protagonists interact as equals is pretty cool as well. Minus the painfully long chapters in here, I did enjoy Leon's campaign quite a bit, and it's nice to see our emo-haired boy back in the limelight once again. However, as we will see, this campaign is maybe the shining part of Resident Evil 6, and so let's look at our boy Chris and how he was done absolutely dirty.
Leon. For the next time you see her.
Women.
open Chris's campaign in a dingy bar in Eastern Europe with an aged mopey Chris drinking his pain away, wallowing in his own misery. We see a BSAA officer walk up by the name of Piers into the bar and approach Chris to convince him to rejoin the BSAA to help with an incident going down in China. Not remembering why he was even wallowing in his own sorrows, Chris reluctantly agrees to join and lead Alpha Team, and the pair head off to China. I guess everybody in this bar was also a BSAA agent at the same time, standing up like all the assholes and Spaceballs.
How many assholes we got on this ship anyhow?
Yo!
I knew it. I'm surrounded by assholes.
Keep firing, assholes!
I want to pause here a moment as I really like this dynamic Capcom tried to pull with Chris. He is dealing with the threat of bioterrorism for over 10 years now since Resident Evil 1, so seeing him in a stupor drunk in a bar makes a ton of sense. While the amnesia-ridden main protagonist is a bit of a trope at these days, the thought of Chris secluding himself from the past makes a ton of sense for me. I mean, who wouldn't it be after dealing with the events of Resident Evil 1, Code Veronica, and then 5? But that's not why he's here, as we will soon learn. While attempting a rescue in China, Chris begins to remember why he stepped away from the BSAA, that being the loss of his entire team in another conflict in Eastern Europe 6 months prior, after being betrayed by Ada Wong and mutating his entire squad. At least, someone who looks like Ada Wong. More on that here real soon. This is basically the entirety of Chapter 2, which is moving through the conflict until the betrayal, working with Sherry and Jake along the way. This part seemingly goes on forever and plays more like a chapter in Gears of War rather than Resident Evil. This section dragged on abnormally long for me, and it was, by the end, extremely painful to go through. I mean, hell, half these guys don't even mutate even though they're supposed to be infected, but I digress. Also, seeing these giant bioweapons come down like they're dropping tanks onto the battlefield, I find mildly hilarious in a weird and sadistic way. But we return to current day Chris in China, where the story essentially turns into a revenge fantasy against Ada Wong, sacrificing nearly everyone on his team short of Piers along the way in order to catch Ada. We catch up to her playing out the scene from Leon's campaign, where the two actually meet, with Ada making her escape and Chris moves in pursuit, this time on a Humvee, murdering more infected militia members known as the Javo along the interstate until reaching an aircraft carrier, and in a scene straight out of the Fast and the Furious, boards the ship as well. Turns out this ship is part of Neo Umbrella, and the missiles on board are loaded with C-virus, and after battling their way through the holds with these weird masked creepy fucking skinny ass creatures, corner Ada on the bridge as she triggers the missile launch, attempting to turn the world into another Raccoon City incident. As they chase Ada, she gets laid into from a helicopter gun and falls to her death in a crumpled mess, thinking her plan and victory is assured. Chris and Piers attempt to stop the missile in a helicopter cover sequence, but fail to stop one, which is the missile we see blast over the city in China. It's then that Leon contacts Chris, asking him to save Sherry and Jake, who are trapped on a nearby oil rig, as Jake is not only the carrier of the antibodies for the C-virus, but is also Albert Wesker's son, the man Chris killed 4 years prior. Chris and Piers find Sherry and Jake, where Chris feels obligated, and rightfully so, to let Jake know that he's the one who killed his father. And rightfully so, Jake pulls a gun on Chris, and after expecting what the outcome was looking to be, Jake files around, grazing Chris on the cheek, and the four move to escape. I do enjoy the slight dialogue here between Chris and Jake as they're riding the platforms together, both on edge on what the other are going to say or do, coming to an agreement that they need to talk about this more later. Knowing that Jake's blood is pretty important, Chris tells Jake and Sherry to leave while him and Pierce stay behind to take out this massive bioweapon that's hanging suspended from the ceiling. Reluctantly, they agree, and Chris and Pierce move to fight and nearly lose, but in the last-ditch attempt, Pierce injects himself with a vial of the C-virus, mutating in order to save his superior and, dare I say at this point, friend. Using the mutation, the group eventually wins out, but at what cost? Piers begins to succumb to the mutation, and Chris, not wanting to lose another compadre, attempts to get both through the escape pods. Prepping for launch, Piers pushes Chris into the pod and shoots Chris up to the surface of the water, sacrificing himself to save his friend. Probably because he knows that it'll be really hard to pick up chicks looking like this. As Chris moves to the surface, he has a renewed sense of duty, having lost everyone he cares about again. We see Chris again in the same bar at the very end, this time getting up to respond to another case and moving on to the next mission. Looking back at Chris's campaign, this is one that I'm really mixed on. As I mentioned earlier in this section, the idea and themes of the campaign had the bones of a story that could have been something really special. We've been with Chris for a long time now, playing with him in 3 separate games, the most of any character in the series to date, from the Spencer Manor in 1, saving Claire and Code Veronica, and murdering hundreds of African natives with Sheva in 5. Chris has been through some shit, and that is sure to take a toll on anyone, even after one of these events, let alone 3. However, the willingness to get back into the fight because he doesn't remember why he quit just rang wrong to me. How do you forget the complete mutations of your entire team in Eastern Europe? And then after the realization as to why he stepped away, Chris's singular focus is retaliation no matter what the cost, just becoming hellbent on murdering Ada. This kind of becomes old after a while. I mean, half the time he just yells, "Where's Ada?" over and over again. Piers, on the other hand, acts as Chris's conscience, working hard to keep him in check, so much so as to chastise him and threaten him if he puts any more of their soldiers and comrades in danger. I actually really like Piers a lot here as a character, with his loyalty not only to the BSAA, but also being there as the second in command and even as a friend for Chris to assist on his path to redemption. The redemption arc, collating with Jake and admitting to killing his dad and being remorseful, also kind of just felt weird to me. Given the events of 5, I'm not so sure there's much to feel bad about here. I mean, Wesker was absolutely batshit and Chris did the right thing doing that. And yes, telling Jake was probably the correct thing as well, but seeing as how Jake, as we'll discuss here soon, was already contending with the fact that his dad was kind of nuts, I'm not so sure why he's mad at Chris for this. I wish we had gone deeper into the nuance of these themes in the middle of the campaign rather than just having massive action sequences, but the beginning and the bookend, ending with the sacrifice of the man who helped Chris out of his downward spiral, is pretty good. Just the entire middle pretty much sucks. And with that, we move on to Jake and Sherry, who similarly have decent ideas but not great execution. So let's continue.
Chris, we need to stay calm.
After what she's done to us, how many of our men are dead because of that bitch?
I'm right there with you, Captain. But your personal vendetta isn't gonna get us anywhere. If you hadn't been blinded by vengeance, we could have prevented some of those deaths.
Shut up.
Do you even care about our mission anymore?
Shut up!
I feel sorry for all the men that died believing in you. What happened to the legendary Chris Redfield, huh? What happened to you? It's a good thing Finn's not around to see you this way.
I'm going after Ada. HQ, this is Alpha Leader. I need a location on Ada Wong.
I'm going with you. Someone's got to keep an eye on you, whether you want them to or not.
Jake and Sherry are the next crew we're going to be looking at. Honestly, this campaign takes the most risks while also suffering from the same pacing issues as Chris's did. We open on Jake, a mercenary part of the Jahavo, injecting with what we now know as the C virus into his body, and while his other cohorts begin to mutate, Jake does not, thinking it's a combat stimulant of some sort to make them better in battle. Sherry bursts into a form that it was in fact the virus, and due to him being unaffected, is determined that he is the potential carrier of the antibodies of the virus that are inside him. It may be the key to saving humanity. She says that she needs to extradite him right away, and Jake is only willing to go for the low price tag of $50 million. The government agrees, and the two begin to move to the extraction zone when they run into Chris and Piers in the Eastern European conflict. And after assisting with taking care of the giant bioweapons that are in pursuit, Chris helps them get onto the chopper, and as the two are flying away, are knocked out of the sky and crash in the middle of the snowy nowhere. Shielding Jake from the shrapnel, Sherry takes a chunk of metal in her leg and after pulling it out, re-heals, the same mutation that we learned that she was injected with in Resident Evil 2. The two seek shelter in a blizzard in a cabin, and the two get closer together, sharing events of their past, and both realizing that they're important to the coming dangers of bioterrorism ahead. Romance is brewing, boys and girls, if it wasn't painfully obvious. This quiet moment is cut short, however, when the soldiers appear to murder the two. As they escape, run into a woman that we saw in the very beginning of the game handing the virus injections out, telling Jake all about Albert Wesker and how he was his father and all the atrocities he committed in the meantime. The two are then captured and sent to a research facility in China, and working together they escape. Jake is obviously still rattled at the realization of his father and the atrocities he committed, and after a heartfelt shake-up by Sherry, the two steal a motorcycle and boogie on to hopefully freedom. This isn't the case, as this is short-lived once again. They become surrounded by Neo Umbrella Jahavo, only to be once again helped by Chris and Piers. I swear these two just spend their entire time being saved by other people. Sherry learns that her superior Simmons, that we know from Leon's campaign, is actually in town, and the two make their way to his location, running into Leon along the way as we saw in his campaign. Leon tells them what Simmons done. Jake and Sherry contemplate how they're going to approach him about what they heard, and as they move forward, find Leon and Helena, beat them to Simmons as well. It is here that Simmons finally admits to everything that he's done and that Leon was in fact right about everything. Leon tells the pair to escape, and in doing so are captured once again and taken to the lab in an oil rig. We now know the bulk of what happens here. Sherry and Jake are freed, run into Chris. Jake finds out Chris killed his dad, and move to escape. While on the way up, they run back into the beast that they've been chasing since Eastern Europe for a final standoff, leading to a sick hand-to-hand combat fight over some lava, and then holding each other as they blast the beast from the Kingdom Come, obviously fully trusting each other at this point, as we can see by this delicious handhold. I haven't brought up this monster much despite how much he shows up in this story, because honestly, he just kind of gets old after the 6th time you see him, with the only fight actually being worth it being the end one where you punch the fucker in the lava, all the Wesker fight in Resident Evil 5, and then blow him up in the escaping train on fire. A lot of it was just running away, and while chase scenes are cool, after so many times just begin to lose their luster after a while. I swear, I think I subconsciously tried to block these out. We reach the epilogue and see Sherry on a plane writing a debrief report about the incident. The BSAA now hiding Jake's relationship to Wesker when she receives the text from Jake, lowering the price of his blood to only $50 rather than the $50 million. Changing his ways to better the world, we see a renewed Jake riding off into the sunset in the desert, moving on to the next adventure. This will be the last we will see of Jake for now in the series as well. I kind of liked him, and watching him contend with his past and soften in the events of the story, it was a fine character change, seeing as he was this grizzly, hardened merc at the very beginning. However, Sherry feels kind of shoehorned in here, creating what is known as small universe syndrome. Sherry, while important to Resident Evil 2 as a small kid whose parents were fucked, there really wasn't a reason why she needed to be involved here at all. I also wish there was more of her aftermath after the events of Resident Evil 2, as this is still a mystery, and how the events of losing both of her parents could actually be pretty interesting. But that's not what we got. We just have a Sherry put in here in order to make sure that we had callbacks to other games. Once again, a lot of the malaise here can be attributed to the pacing, and like the other stories, there are nuggets of actually good and genuinely interesting ideas here, but focusing on creating 4 separate campaigns makes every idea feel like a half-baked turd cookie, where you can see the delicious cookie, but it's surrounded by hours of action-fueled shit mess. This is the campaign that feels most linked to all except for one, that being the last story we will be looking at today. That is the through-line character that we've seen in each and every one of these campaigns thus far, Ada Wong.
You know anything about an Albert Wesker?
What?
Take that as a yes. We talked about him a lot. I guess he had an antibody that could fight off any virus. Apparently, he abused his gift, took it for granted, and then ended up turning himself into some kind of monster. You know, I thought dear old dad was just a deadbeat who skipped out on us. No, he was actually a freaking nut job who almost destroyed the world.
Ada's campaign feels different right off the bat, as she is entirely solo in this adventure in regards to her story. If you have a buddy playing co-op with you, there will be another agent with her as well, but this character is not part of any sort of narrative, so just kind of a stand-in. One day, Ada receives a message from Simmons regarding information that he claims to be of interest to her in her future endeavors. Boarding a submarine that the message points to, she works her way to the cabin through the mass amounts of mutated creatures we saw in the aircraft carrier guarding the way, reaching a door with a fingerprint scanner, which to her surprise, her prints are actually encoded into the door. Inside, she finds orders to capture Jake due to his immunity to the C virus. However, these are dated 6 months prior with no knowledge of her actually receiving them. Wondering what this means, she finds that the submarine's actually being scuttled, and after a grand escape of ziplining and explosions and swimming and the like, Ada gets another call from Simmons, revealing that there's going to be a bioterror attack in both the United States and Tall Oaks, and following up with another one in China. In order to investigate the information she received, Ada heads to Tall Oaks, where Leon and Helena are contending with the president's assassination. We make our way through the graveyard and run into Leon and Helena, where we meet them in Leon's story, and after the whole Deborah incident, Ada makes her way further into the lab. A lot of Ada's campaign revolves around backtracking through areas that we'd seen in prior campaigns after meeting the original cast, so we should know the layout here fairly well. Ada finds the tape we ourselves found earlier as Leon of herself busting out of a cocoon. We now know that there are actually two Adas, the real one and the fake one, this fake one going off the rails, defecting from Simmons and working to overthrow the organization Simmons is a part of. Ada, not wanting her to take the fall for these incidents, leaves to find the fake Ada to take care of this doppelganger of hers. This does shed a lot of light that the Ada we had seen in both Chris and Jake's campaign was not always the real Ada, leading to the death of Chris' squad. Plot twist! There are two Adas! Anyway, making her way to China, the third chapter is basically just her helping Sherry and Jake, seeing Chris and Leon in a factory, and making her way to the last known location of fake Ada. And while seeing all these old chess pieces back into play, recognizes that this incident seems to be like Raccoon City Part 2. She makes her way to the aircraft carrier as we went to as Chris, and boards in search of fake Ada. Making her way through, she finds notes and videos based on the creation of fake Ada, essentially that she's a clone made from the lead scientist, Carla Radames, injected with a sample of Ada's DNA as well as the C virus and placed in a pod, all in an effort to make a version of Ada that would actually listen to orders, as the Ada we are playing as is known to go rogue, as we've seen in the last two games. And all of this instigated by Simmons. As fake Ada existed, the scientist Carla's subconscious begins to slowly bubble to the surface, leading to Carla/fake Ada to wanting to get revenge on Simmons for essentially killing her. Ada finds Carla lying on the deck, dead, body broken, and twisted beyond repair. Moving down to ensure she was actually dead, the body springs to life, melting into what I can only refer to as C-virus cum, mutating and screaming that she is the only true Ada and attempting to kill her actual true counterpart. This fight revolves around running and blowing up barrels, and while the spectacle is there to be sure, this fight just wasn't fun at all to me, and in fact was pretty frustrating if I'm being honest. I'm all for gimmick fights, but this one was just not a lot of fun. I mean, you just have to shoot through her face in order to shoot some barrels. Like, it's nothing really all that special. And after murdering cum Ada, real Ada hops into a helicopter to find and finish Simmons. This is beginning to get confusing, and I'm glad that cum Ada is now dead. Flying through the city, Ada spots Leon and Helena, and from the chopper helps the two with T-Rex Simmons and takes the pair to the top of the quad tower, knowing that the full data of the clone experiments is somewhere within. Simmons popped back up for a fight on the bridge, and after subsequently defeating him as we did in Leon's, zips away, leaving Leon sad and alone as we saw in the first campaign. She makes her way to the lab, finding notes, research terminals, and most of all, a single cocoon. Unloading about 5 magazines into the lab from her machine gun and causing its total destruction, she escapes, answering another phone call and smiling. We fade to black on Ada Wong and the entirety of Resident Evil 6. While there's a ton of late game reveals here when it comes to Ada's story, and it's important to the Resident Evil 6 narrative as a whole, I could not stand this campaign at all. With what felt like over half of it just being quick time events, chapter 3 being literally nothing but running and shooting a couple things, and every other location being somewhere we've already been with other characters time and time again, this part feels like an absolute slog due to the amount of asset reuse here. I understand that these stories are all supposed to interconnect, but literally half of it feels like I'm just playing Leon's campaign all over again, but from a different point of view. Not only that, this is the part where the plot really jumps the shark. What with the clone Ada being the real bad guy the whole time, it just feels kind of like lazy and a waste of ton of potential playing as Ada. She hasn't been back in the series since, minus some remakes of course, and I kind of hope she stays there. We've been around this character for 3 games now, and short of just being mysterious and helping others in the lore, she hasn't provided a ton of actual gameplay or narrative to the player of said games. I don't know, I guess I just never really understood the appeal of her in the first place other than just badass in a dress. Let me know what you guys think of Ada in the comments down below, and keep your horn doggery to yourself. Wrapping up the campaigns here is a lot, and all in all, almost all these had some slight nuggets of something that could actually turn out to be awesome, but misses the mark in a ton of ways to keep any of them from being truly stand out. And while Leon's campaign does feel most akin to current Resident Evil games at the time, the other 3 just kind of feel like misses, either being getting too focused on action like Chris's, terribly paced like Jake's, or just boring like Ada's. I feel like this is likely due to the split focus we discussed earlier. If Capcom had just focused on one of these stories, ensuring that the pacing and story beats hit just right, and trimmed down the amount of senseless action rooms that we get, this could have been a much better game. Revisiting all the same spots 4 times over gives the feeling that been there, done that, making each subsequent campaign feel more and more like a drag. The same neon backstreets, while looking good, the same graveyard, the same snow buildings, hell, half of the fights are even the same. I understand the desire of bringing all the old characters back for one last hurrah, but if you're going to do that, at least let them be together for more than 5 minutes at a time. I mean, hell, half the engagements, the group just say hi and then bye, and the best we get is a boss fight sequence that we've already done 4 times before that as Jake before leaving. You never get that moment where Leon, Chris, and Sherry with all their subsequent partners are fighting with their backs against the wall, holding their own in the infected wasteland. That is infected China or infected Tall Oaks. This all just felt like a complete miss for me, but what did you guys think of Resident Evil 6? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel as it does make the number get a little bit bigger for me and gets this out to more people. This video was a long one, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and from here we're going to be moving on to the next one, thank God. That being Resident Evil Revelations and then Revelations 2. As always, thank you all for watching, and from all my returning viewers, thank you for coming back. My name is Brendan, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.
That's for my sister.
Come on. Let's get to the chopper.